Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're really proud that we've got people from across Canada joining us. There are people from the national and provincial associations, from governments, from academia. We've got employers, students, and many more. It's great to have you join us. I am Philip Mondor, President and CEO of Tourism HR Canada, an organization with a mandate aimed at building a world-leading tourism workforce. Tourism HR Canada facilitates, coordinates, and enables human resource development activities that support a globally competitive and sustainable industry and foster the development of a dynamic and resilient workforce. Joining me today as a co-presenter is Callum McDonald, VP, Labour Market Intelligence. Many of you know Callum, but for those that are going to meet him for the first time, you'll soon discover he is one of Canada's preeminent experts on the tourism labor market research. Now, Tourism HR Canada is responsible for Canada's foundational labor market research system that we are graciously funded by the federal government to support. As many of you know, we've been tracking the impacts of COVID on the tourism workforce. There are many facets to this research, some of which you will get some insights today. In response to the impacts of COVID-19 on the workforce, it was in June that we broadcast the first State of the Tourism Workforce session. This was followed up in September with another session, and today we have our third. In between each of these, there have been many changes, as you will see today. Now, today's session is divided into two main components. Callum will present the most current labor market data illustrating the impacts of COVID since the onset in February. This will set it up for the second component where I'll speak to the recommended strategies that includes programs and policies that we believe are most critical to tackle, all focused on a job recovery plan. The fact is we are facing a precipice. Unless we act soon, there are many signs that recovery will be seriously hampered and our ability to compete for visitors will be diminished. Tourism, after all, is dependent on its people. Without investing in the people, it's a classic example of seduction and abandonment. The marketing aims to seduce our visitor, but when they come, then if we're unable to serve them and we falter, then it's a real serious concern of abandonment. It means less product, poor or mediocre services, increased costs to operate, higher risks, especially with people's safety and health, and much more. Look, today's session is intended to inform where we go collectively and hopefully to create some urgency in acting. And this leads me to one more point. It's a paradox, or it appears to be a paradox or an apparent contradiction that I'm often asked about. People say to me, with the level of unemployment and the fact that many businesses remain shuttered or services are diminished, how is it that we are running short of workers, or why do we have a shortfall? This question can be raised in many ways, and it can be a subject of a session on its own. But the fact is quite simple. Before this pandemic, we were facing shortages, both in terms of the number of workers and the skills needed for this sector. And this has been the case for a decade, but increasingly so in the last several years. Coming out of COVID, the shortages are projected to be more acute. In fact, last summer, and now we're already hearing from businesses and employers they're having a difficulty finding workers. Now, we've done a specific article on this, and it's also a component within one of our recent webinars. We'll include the link as one of the follow-up items from today's session so that I don't take up more of the time on the topic. Bottom line, we are going to be facing major shortages and we have to tackle it now. So let's get started. Before we do, just a note for everybody. We are taping the session. So you will be able to access this same session and re-listen to it or download the PDF of the PowerPoint itself. There's a lot of data that includes charts and diagrams. And indeed, we had to be selective even on what we could squeeze into the 1 hour. But don't be worried, you can collect this later. And this session will be translated for download at a later date. Both Heather and John are monitoring the Q&A section. We encourage you to use these, and where possible, they will answer your questions along the way. But we won't be able to answer everybody, perhaps. And if that's the case, not to worry, we will use that as part of our follow-up to everyone. Finally, one more thing I will cover off before I hand this over to Callum. And it's just to provide a little bit of insight on what goes into looking at labor market projections. You know, this is a tricky one. There are a lot of different factors that shape some of our thinking on workforce recovery. I'm going to be very brief here just to help prime the discussion. Recovery scenarios for the workforce are shaped by different interactions of complex and underlying factors. I've selected 6 of them just to give a little bit of context. So we know for sure that vaccination response will have an impact on recovery. In other words, the timing will make a difference, and just how quickly Canada is able to do this relative to the rest of the world, and in particular, what the impact might be in the US if they lag. Bottom line, until there's a level of vaccination, we know that there will be still the same kinds of restrictions we face today. Things such as closed borders or limited travel options and so on. So this does impact the projections. When do we anticipate vaccination levels will be where it's going to enable us to see some level of response? It also suggests things like the focus on local tourism as a start, which I think all of us are quite familiar with. Of course, policies and regulations are another factor. As we all know, the stay-at-home requirements or travel restrictions, or increasingly more a new regulation that's going to go on to health and safety will impact what it means to recover with our workforce. It sets the pace, but it also creates demands on skills training and on supply issues. Economic context has a bearing, not just from the point of governments and looking at what they may choose to invest in recovery strategies and marketing and matters of that type, but also on the traveler. You know, can we anticipate that they have pent up demand and want to spend a lot of money and start traveling as soon as possible? Or is the reverse true? Has this been a burden on them, and has it inhibited their chances for future travel? There are a lot of different factors that you could consider there. The political context does matter. You know, it takes a lot of money to recover from a pandemic. And, you know, is there a will? Will the political context be there where they will prioritize the sector? And think about something like the US, for example, who we know is facing a very large scale challenge with this pandemic. How soon will their recovery be? So that political context can indeed impact our own idea of what projections look like and what it could mean for the health of our sector. Supply issue is one of our major concerns. It is both around the products that we would have to have available in order to meet demand, products and services, but also the people. And that is going to be the subject of a large portion of today's presentation, just as this idea of public and consumer sentiment will come up. As we all know, there's been some great challenges that have come about as a result of the pandemic and what tourism has meant for communities. We will see some evidence of that in today's presentation as we've done some research on this particular item. Look, I could spend a lot more time on this, but I just wanted to get you thinking a little bit about the kinds of factors that contribute to the thinking about how to look at projections. And I'll end it with one more slide, and that is just a note that we should be optimistic. There are certainly investments being made by the federal government and a focus on recovery. This tweet from September 9th was really a good example among many that followed on the interest of not just having strategies in place, but investments. And the last economic recovery statement did include a number of tactics that we see will benefit us. But there's more that needs to be done, and our reliance on public investments will matter greatly. Okay, I'm going to hand this over now to Callum, who is going to walk you through a lot of the most current labor market data we have, at least a good sampling of it to help set the stage. So Callum, off to you.
All right, thank you very much, Phil. I appreciate that. I'm just going to share my own screen so that you can see the continuing PowerPoint presentation. And that should be appearing now. So again, thank you all. I appreciate everyone joining us today to learn a little bit more about what we're seeing in the data and how employment in our sector is being affected by COVID-19. Of course, a lot of this has been affected very badly. I will start with saying that. I do want to deal with one issue though, before we really dive into our monthly labor force survey data. And many of you have probably attended other webinars, have looked at projections that have been made about how this is impacting the tourism sector. And you may have noticed that two different sets of numbers are being used. 750,000 tourism jobs and 1.9 million tourism jobs. And the language used to describe these two sets of numbers often gets used interchangeably. Both are often simply referred to as tourism jobs because that's the easiest way to kind of approach it when you're doing a webinar. But the proper technical definition is that one is counting the number of jobs in Canada that is attributable to tourism demand. In other words, the number of jobs that are supported by tourists spending money to buy goods and services. And in 2019, just under 750,000 jobs in Canada were attributable to tourism demand. The other number, the 1.9 million, the one that we most often use, measures all jobs in tourism industries. And it's very important to measure both because tourism businesses, of course, do not just serve tourists. If you think about restaurants and the recreation industries, only about 20% of their demand comes from tourists. Now, that's a pretty significant amount, but they're also serving a lot of non-tourists. When you go to a restaurant or a nearby ski hill or a museum within your own community, you are spending money there, you are supporting jobs at that business, but you're doing so as a local resident rather than as a tourist. Now, even hotels and air transport get some of their demand from locals, although it is not much. So the 750,000 number is very, very important because it is a measure of the number of all jobs in the Canadian economy that are being supported by tourists. The 1.9 million job number is just as important because it captures the full scope of employment in the tourism sector. And in 2019, as I said, there were about 1.9 million jobs in tourism. So jobs attributed to tourism demand versus all jobs in 5 tourism industries: accommodation, recreation and entertainment, food services, transportation, and travel services. From a workforce perspective, we need to track the full scope of employment because it is an indicator of the overall health of the tourism sector. Particularly right now when international tourism is all but non-existent and domestic tourism is curtailed to a greater or lesser degree depending on where you are located within Canada. It is local demand that is currently sustaining a lot of the employment that does exist at tourism businesses, although even there, of course, we know that that is negatively affected by limits on seating capacity or outright lockdowns, which have forced some businesses to close their doors. And as we recover, it will be the local component that comes back first and drives the first steps of the recovery, then followed by rebounding domestic tourism and then international tourism. So just to recap, the 750,000 jobs attributable to tourism is a measure of jobs supported by visitor spending. It helps show the economic impact of tourists on the Canadian economy. The 1.9 million number shows the total number of jobs in tourism industries, regardless of who is spending the money that supports those jobs. And for this reason, if you've seen the different projections that some of the national organizations have made, you'll see that projections starting with that 750,000 number as a base actually show more severe job losses, often down 50% or more, whereas the projections we're making using the 1.9 million number show employment down about 30% in 2020. Now that's very severe, of course, but somewhat less so because that local demand is still there to a degree. Now, that said, of course, this is a very fluid situation. It's changing monthly, and for monthly data, we have to rely on the labor force survey to track the changes in employment levels. And in doing so, we're going again to a slightly different source of data. So just to introduce some confusion, this is very much aligned with the 1.9 million jobs number, but it's slightly different because the labor force survey measures the number of people working in the industry in a given month. It's not a jobs number, it's an actual people estimate of the people working there. And as you can see, back in February, there were just over 2 million Canadians working in tourism industries. By April, over 800 of those individuals were no longer employed in the tourism sector. Now, as that initial reaction and those initial shutdowns lifted, people were hired back. By August, employment had risen by about another 570,000 people relative to where it was in April. Now, that still means that there were about 310,000 fewer people employed in tourism than there had been in February. And because tourism, of course, we're a seasonal industry, we see an increase in demand in the summer. It makes sense to look at how employment is, what employment is like year over year. And if we compare August 2019 and August 2020, there were actually 460,000 fewer workers in the tourism sector this August than 1 year prior. And of course, as we moved into the fall, employment started to decline once more. Now, this is actually something that happens every year. We always see some decline in employment going into September or October. You know, the demand decreases slightly. People are heading back to work, so they're less likely to be going on vacation. Our student workers, they go back to school, so they're no longer employed. So we normally see somewhat of a decline. But for most of the time, this decline usually stops in mid-autumn. You can see that in the diagram for 2019. We saw a decrease in employment into September. Sometimes, some years that goes into October, but then it usually levels off. That has not been the case this year. And that is really being driven by the second wave of COVID-19 and the restrictions that are being implemented in response to that. As of December, the last month for which we have monthly data right now, there were over 520,000 fewer workers in tourism than there were the previous year at the same time. And if we look at the unemployment rate across the year, month to month, we see a similar pattern, although there's a bit of a lag in that data here. We know that 880,000 tourism workers lost their jobs in March and April. Now, many of those individuals did not immediately start looking for work because of the uncertainty around, well, everything that existed at that time. And to be counted as unemployed, you do need to be actively seeking work. Unemployment then peaked in May, dropped through the summer as people returned to work to a degree. And entering the fall, it has started to rise slightly once more. I will say, though, that based on the loss of employment we have seen, the increase in the unemployment rate in the fall has not been as great as we would have expected. So that suggests either that those who are losing their jobs this fall are not seeking new employment right away, or they are finding jobs elsewhere. And so the next few slides, I'll just say, we have all of this data on our website. We can break it down, or you can go to our website and find it broken down by province, by industry group. I'm only going to show you a few of the provincial data for a few of the provinces because I want to show exactly how much it is the second wave of COVID that's currently impacting employment in our industry in the fall. So we know in March and April, international tourism demand plummeted. And of course, international tourism never really came back in a big way. Over the summer, we did see some increase in domestic tourism, and that supported some of the jobs in our industry and contributed to that increase in employment that occurred over the summer. But of course, there's less domestic tourism demand in the fall. There always is. And it's really the local demand that's supporting employment at that time. And it's the resurgence of COVID-19 and the restrictions that affect local demand that have negatively impacted employment. Quebec was one of the first provinces to tighten restrictions in the fall. Now, those restrictions initially were not province-wide, but in October, Montreal, Quebec City were both affected by restrictions, and that dropped employment in that province by 15% in that month. In fact, Quebec was basically responsible for all of the employment drop we saw nationally in October. If you took out the drop in Quebec in October, we almost saw no drop in employment at the national level. Oops. If you look at Manitoba, of course, Manitoba implemented very severe restrictions province-wide in November. They'd actually seen a slight increase in employment in October, but once those province-wide restrictions came into place, employment in tourism dropped by 23%, and those were maintained into December. So we have not seen any regrowth of employment there. Similarly, Nova Scotia implemented severe restrictions in December. So again, they'd seen a slight decline in employment, which you would expect in the fall due to a lack of tourism or decrease in tourism demand. But once those restrictions were implemented, we saw a drop of employment, an employment drop of 20% just in 1 month. In Ontario, on the other hand, the approach was much more regional until late December. And there we have seen more of a slow, ongoing decline in employment. Now with strict province-wide measures in place as of December 26th, and then actually even restrictions announced were in place as of yesterday, we may very well see that significant 1 month drop come January. In other provinces where restrictions were not needed or more limited, the monthly employment trends we've seen throughout the fall are much more aligned with what we would usually expect over the course of the fall. Now, that said, tourism employment is still lower across all provinces because we never got back to where we would normally expect to be over the summer months. Even if the trend going into the fall is the same, it's at a lower level. So this slide shows tourism employment levels in each province for December 2019 and December 2020. And on a year-over-year basis, the greatest employment decreases have actually been seen in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. Employment is closest to last year's levels in Atlantic Canada, with the exception of Nova Scotia, where of course we saw a radical reduction in employment in December. And the monthly employment trends also differ by industry group within tourism. So all industry groups lost a massive amount of employment in March and April, but the trend since that time has been different. Food and beverage services recovered employment right up until September, and then saw 3 months of employment decreases. Now, the food and beverage services industry usually does shed some employment in the fall, but the continued losses we've seen in November and December have greatly exceeded what we would normally expect for this time of year, and that can largely be attributed to measures that limit indoor dining. For the accommodation industry, as of December, the accommodation industry has actually now seen the greatest loss of employment in terms of a percentage relative to February. So despite ongoing employment gains that industry saw from May right up until August, the end of the summer season has resulted in ongoing employment losses since then. Now, this is less driven by lockdowns than by tourism demand levels. Occupancy rates in Canada peaked at 42.9% at the end of August, which is very, very low for that time of year, but still, considering that occupancy rates were down around 10% back in April, improvement. However, since then, occupancy rates across Canada have fallen to an average of 23.5% for the week ending December 19th, and actually fell below 20% over the Christmas holidays. That data comes from STR. And of course, low demand for hotel rooms leads to lower employment. The recreation industry has seen the second greatest loss of employment relative to February as of December. And of course, employment in recreation usually does peak in the summer and then drops back during the fall as your seasonal businesses, golf courses, marinas, those close for the year. So we usually do see a fair decrease in employment in recreation and entertainment, but this year, on top of the usual seasonal change that we see, of course, facilities like museums that operate year-round some of them are being forced to close their door because of restrictions, and that's adding to the employment losses we're seeing here. Travel services is a bit of a different story. In the initial months of the pandemic, the travel services industry lost the greatest percentage of employment, and then employment actually dropped even further in August and September following a mild recovery in June and July. In September, employment in travel services was 50% lower than it had been in February. And that's due to the seasonal effect that happens within this industry. Travel services tends to be most active during the winter months because it's through the travel services industry that people book their travel outside of Canada, often to sunshine destinations. And so they actually have seen an increase in employment, mostly part-time employment, in October, November, and December, because there are still some Canadians who are traveling to destinations outside the country, and that has driven some employment increase in that industry. Transportation industry has actually overall seen the least loss of employment since the pandemic started. But with transportation, I would like to make the point that this covers over a lot of differences between very specific industries. If we look at the charter bus industry that falls within transportation, employment's actually up slightly. Air transportation down significantly, 50% or more. And of course, we've just heard that some new layoffs are coming in that industry. So if we compare December's employment numbers to where we were in February, you can see that employment is down in all industry groups. While accommodation is down the most, followed by recreation and entertainment, all of the tourism industries are hurting in terms of employment. Transportation is down the least, but it's still down almost 20%. That's a lot. And what I'd like also to point out is I've focused specifically on the tourism sector right now, but it's important to remember that these employment losses due to COVID-19 have not been evenly spread across all industries within the economy. So tourism industries employed about 10% of Canadian workers before the pandemic, but a much greater share of COVID-19 employment losses have occurred within this sector. Tourism employment losses made up of half of the year-over-year employment losses that occurred in March. So as tourism businesses were the first to be forced to close and see demand dry up as international borders shut, we immediately lost a lot of employment, but so did a large number of other industries. In the following 2 months, many other industries also started to close because they had either lost demand for their products or just because of uncertainty around what was happening. In March and April, we didn't really know where this was going. However, as restrictions loosened, the share of year-over-year employment losses that were attributable to the tourism sector started to grow once more. Other industries started to reopen and have found ways to remain open, whereas tourism is very affected by local lockdown measures. And as you can see, as we get into the winter months, tourism's share of the total employment losses that we see across the entire economy are close to 90%. Up until this point, I've been looking at monthly data for both the industries and the tourism sector as a whole. But as you saw when looking at the monthly data for the accommodation industry, and particularly the travel services industry, there are seasonal trends that affect the monthly employment figures regardless of the pandemic. You saw travel services employment going down in the summer, and that would have happened to a degree anyways, because that's a low point in their season. To remove the seasonal employment patterns from the equation, I can take the monthly employment figures and get an average for the year, now that we're here in December, that allows us to compare overall employment for the year 2019 and 2020, and compare each industry taking out that seasonal variability. And as you can see, within the different industries, employment losses have been severe across all industries. They have most affected the accommodation industry, where it has lost close to 30% of its employed workers, followed by the travel services industry, which has lost 26%, of its workers, but all sectors of our industry have been affected quite severely. And similarly, if you look at the average unemployment rates in tourism, comparing 2019 and 2020, in 2019, the average unemployment rate for tourism was 4.6%, well below the average unemployment rate for the economy as a whole. This year, the average unemployment rate, 14.6%, well above the average unemployment rate for the economy as a whole. Now, putting aside the labor force survey data for a moment and kind of getting back to that 1.9 million jobs number, we worked with, sorry, I'm just going to go back here. Sorry, there we are. In the late fall, we worked with, or in the fall, we worked with the Conference Board of Canada to project how many full year jobs, so we're going back to that 1.9 million jobs number, would be lost due to the impact of COVID-19. We also wanted to project how the sector would rebound in terms of employment once restrictions started to be lifted. At that time, we projected that tourism jobs, the number of jobs in the tourism sector, would drop to 1.36 million in 2020 before rebounding to 1.65 million in 2021. Now, that's a fairly significant rebound, but also does not bring us close to where we were in 2019 in terms of jobs. In fact, at that time, we were projecting it would take until 2024 to get back to employment levels we saw last year. 2019, forget that we're in 2021 now. And some industries, it would actually take until 2025 to fully recover to pre-pandemic employment levels. Now, what we're seeing 3-4 months later from when we initially made these projections, it is starting to look, at least for 2020, as if these projections were somewhat optimistic. The restrictions this fall and winter were greater than we had expected or perhaps hoped for. And we still have no set timelines for borders reopening. That said, as Phil mentioned at the start of this presentation, vaccines are being rolled out. So it really comes down to a question, I think, of can enough people be vaccinated before summer 2021 that allows us to have close to, and I'd put close to in quotation marks, a normal summer season in terms of the restrictions that we see on people's movement. That is really going to determine how accurate our projections are. The one other thing I will mention here too is that these projections show the number of jobs that could be supported by demand, so demand from both locals and tourists. Whether we will have enough workers to fill these jobs upon recovery is another question, because we know that we have lost a lot of workers. Now, many of them are still unemployed, but others will have sought and found work in other industries, which are not as affected as tourism has been. And we also know that sentiment towards our sector has taken a hit. We recently conducted 2 general population surveys of Canadians, the full results of which will be released in a couple of weeks. The first was conducted using Leger's National Omni-Panel Survey, and this was a survey of Canadians on their general sentiments towards tourism. And in general, Canadians are quite receptive to tourism. They want visitors to come to Canada, have an enjoyable experience, and they want to make those visitors feel welcome. A minority of Canadians, but a sizable one, do feel that visitors can prevent locals from enjoying their own community, and too many visitors can lessen their feeling of safety. But as I said, those are a minority, and overall, the general sentiment is one of welcome for tourists. Nearly 9 in 10 Canadians believe that the tourism industry is important to the economic well-being of both their province and Canada. Conversely, fewer Canadians see the economics of benefits of tourism directly in their own community, but a majority still believe that it's important. But while overall sentiment towards the sector is generally positive, the pandemic has had an impact. A little over 1/3 of Canadians report that their perceptions of the tourism sector have become increasingly negative since the pandemic began. The second of the two surveys looked specifically at Canadians' perceptions of tourism as a place of work. Now, this survey was also conducted by Leger, and this was a survey of 5,000 Canadians that we did during the month of November. We did a very similar survey to this back in 2016, and at that time, that survey revealed that there were both positive perceptions of working in tourism, as well as some negative perceptions that we knew we had to overcome. We wanted to do a similar survey in 2020 to see if the pandemic had aggravated some of those negative perceptions, or if it had added any new negative perceptions that weren't there before. 20% of the respondents to this survey had worked in the tourism sector in the past, and 6% were currently working in the sector, which was good because it allowed us to compare Canadians' overall sentiments to those of people who actually had experience working in our sector. A couple of things that came up. So I'm just going to go back there. 39% of Canadians did say that their view of tourism as a place of work was more negative than it had been prior to the pandemic outbreak. 22% said they would need a vaccine before they would feel comfortable working in the sector. Most Canadians identified compensation as an issue related to work in our sector. 69% said that in order to attract more people to the sector, we would need to increase wages and improve working conditions. Young people said that they were far more likely to be willing to pursue a temporary career in tourism. 21% said they would be interested in doing that, notably because tourism can provide them with a summer job while they are in school. New immigrants, and that would be those who have lived in Canada for less than 5 years, were most likely to say that they were interested in pursuing a full-time career in tourism. And they were also more likely to agree that tourism provides a good opportunity for new immigrants to enter the Canadian labor market. Similarly, 18% of those who identified as visible minorities indicated that they would be interested in a full-time career in tourism. But on the negative side, they did say that they felt often visible minorities must take low-paying jobs within the sector. %, as I said, of Canadians indicated that they had a more negative view of the tourism industry as a place of work than they did prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. Importantly, respondents who had worked in the tourism sector were more likely to indicate that their view was now negative. 50% of those who were either working or had worked in the industry said that their view was more negative now post-COVID. And of course, it's going to be very important that we address the concerns of individuals who have worked in the tourism industry, as these people, they act as ambassadors and spokespeople for our industry. And if those individuals have a negative perception of the industry, it can lead them to dissuade others from pursuing a career or even just a temporary job in the sector. The results of the survey showed that out of all Canadians, 46% would recommend a career in tourism to family and friends. Notably, this is a drop of 16% since 2017, when 62% of Canadians said they would recommend tourism as a career to family and friends. What we did find in the 2017 survey was that respondents who had worked in tourism were more likely to recommend a career in tourism compared to those who have not worked in tourism. 62% of Canadians back in 2017 said they'd recommend a career. 69% of those who had worked in tourism said they would recommend it as a career. So that was a positive that came out of that survey in 2017. The 2020 study that we just did actually also saw a similar trend. Only 46% of Canadians are now willing to recommend a career in tourism. But if we group just those who have experience working in our sector, there has been a bit of a drop. But 63% from that group are still willing to recommend tourism. Now that may seem counterintuitive because we know they actually they're more likely to have had a negative view or or for their view to have been negatively affected by COVID-19. But the fact that despite that, they're still willing to recommend tourism as a place of work is a positive. That said, the overall story for our workforce has a much more is one that is they have a much more negative view of the industry than they did before. They have less desire to work in tourism. Their perceptions of personal health and safety have been negatively affected while working in the industry, as have their general comfort levels. And of course, not surprisingly, their feelings of job security have taken a significant hit. Among Canadians in general, so that last slide was looking at the responses just from those who work or have worked in tourism. This slide shows the perceptions of all respondents who filled out our survey, whether they worked in tourism at one point or not. Among Canadians in general, the desirability of a career in the sector has been negatively affected. So in orange on the right-hand side of the screen, you have those saying a career in each of the tourism industries is desirable. In gray on the left, those saying it was undesirable. And for each industry, pre-pandemic is on the top, post-pandemic is on the bottom. So I think there's two things to note here. One, the desirability of a career in tourism industries was not high prior to COVID. So we had our work cut out for us to kind of educate Canadians about the career opportunities that do exist in tourism, even before the pandemic struck. But the negative perception has significantly increased since the outbreak of COVID-19. So that effort that we're going to have to put into educating Canadians about the career opportunities that do exist has become harder because of the perception of our industry. And that's where I'll leave it in terms of the data that we have. We've got a lot of data. I've only kind of scratched the surface of what we have available. A lot of it is on our website. So you can go to tourismhr.ca, and under the tab Labor Market Information, there is a page called the Tourism Employment Tracker Insights into COVID-19's Impact. A lot of these slides that you saw today during my part of the presentation are available on that webpage. Covers employment by province, by industry group. We also look at hours of work in the various different sectors. We also have a number of economic indicators such as gross domestic product by tourism industry shown on that page. All of these are updated as that monthly data becomes available, and it's there for you to access and see. And every second week, we put out our Tourism HR Insider, which covers a range of topics related to employment in the tourism industry. I really highly suggest that you sign up for this if you are interested in getting notifications about the most recent labor market information that we have made available. If you look for this particular symbol when that newsletter comes out, those are the most recent labor market information insights that we have available. And of course, as I mentioned, those two perceptions reports, or those two perception surveys that I have been drawing on for this particular presentation, the full results are going to be released in 2 weeks, and it will be indeed HR Insider through which we release those. So with this, I will turn it back over to Phil.
Sorry about that delay. I fumbled there, but we're back online. Okay, thank you, Callum. As you could tell from the selected data that we've supplied today, it reinforces the challenge that we're going to have coming up. The precarity of the employment situation and concerns raised around safety on health, on wages, the fact that there's a shrinking supply, and the fact that there's a reduced rate and an increasingly reduced rate of people that are looking at returning or are seeing the sector in positive light, amongst other factors, does raise a lot of concern for us. It's time to act now. We do need to start with our investments to begin to recover. After all, if we are fortunate to see some recovery at the pace that we're anticipating with a little bit of gain this summer, it's only weeks away. It may not feel like it, but I should remind you that it's not that far away, and we do need to start acting today. What we've done in this section is look at some of what I've identified as priority strategies. We've attempted to distill this into 4 key areas. This again could be a lot bigger in terms of messaging and ideas and content, but we've tried to be selective and focus on what we think are perhaps the most important to deal with, and ones that we think are very doable collectively to focus on. So in terms of restarting the tourism workforce with a main focus on a job recovery strategy, we see 4 main strategy areas. 1 around skills, the supply, 1 around sentiment and strategy. I'm going to go through each of these very briefly to give you a feel for the kinds of things we think would be helpful. I should also add that when we were pulling this together, it was based not only on the data we're seeing in the trends, but we did look at what other countries are doing, and including what was being suggested by the World Tourism Organization, amongst others. So everyone is struggling with this concern, and there's a lot of different ideas out there, but it does relatively distill to some very similar themes. On the first point, I want to talk about skills. This is not a new topic. It's one we've raised before, and it's probably the most evident one in terms of what we need to worry about. Basically, with the tourism, it's a different game than it was before. There are new skills that have emerged and different demands in terms of what's happening in workplaces. I selected just 8 examples on here on sort of the evolution or the shift that we're seeing in terms of skills demand. And I might add, and I think I need to really importantly enforce here the idea that this is not just about frontline workers. A very large portion of the upskilling, retraining, if you like, or new skilling is really focused largely on operation and business needs. So a lot of this burden, if you want, is put on the owner-operator, perhaps more so than frontline. And indeed, frontline do need new skills as well, but our data and employers have suggested that that's not the bigger challenge. Many of those are fairly tenable to manage. Still, I would highlight a number of points here. Not that I want to get into each one of these, but when we're thinking about, I'll just to highlight 1 or 2 because of time. Indeed, the idea of business resilience is probably not a surprise to see it tracking. This is an area where people are looking for better ways of managing risk, looking at how to manage crisis preparedness. It had been tracking a little bit prior to COVID, and you could see in some countries like Australia in particular, where investments were made on things like recovery from catastrophic weather. We did see evidence of work on recovery from pandemics, but of course, no one experienced it as we had with COVID. So there are also examples of recovery from economic downturns. Bottom line, businesses need better management of their stability plans because we'll be able to better fare what we see as a bumpy road ahead and the possibility of future pandemics, God forbid, but indeed weather incidents and other matters. So this is, I think, become acutely familiar and aware with people because they've been experiencing it. And what we've also used as another example on here would be the environmental one. Even in public policy, not just in Canada, but in nearly every country, we've been able to identify their practices moving forward. There's a lot of reinforcing strategy moving forward on sustainable practices for businesses. And that may have to do with the fact that during COVID, Many had to learn to be relatively self-sufficient, and there were disruptions with supply chains, amongst other factors, that had people thinking more carefully about sustainable practices, which of course was something people were doing before, but in some ways it was accelerated, and the demands for that will probably continue to grow. And finally, one more example I'll use on here has to do with technology. And again, that's not a new category for us in some ways. However, the use and integration of new technology has certainly been ramped up. And it has to do with operational issues and staff needs for sure, but also around consumer supports, the use of social media and the like. Community engagement is on here. People might be surprised to see that, but there's a lot of work we've done identifying the fact that recovery is going to be very closely tied to the ability of our businesses to work at a community level with planning and integration of activities that involve community in order to bring back the workforce. In fact, we did a specific webinar on that very topic, and it will be included as one of our follow-up items to this session as a link. Indeed, there are other skills, by the way, but the bottom message here, bottom line message is there is a very different work context that we're dealing with. People are requiring anchor staff that are highly versatile with their skills, that can be adaptable to a range of environments, that can have a level of independence or autonomy. And the more casual workers are likely going to still serve a number of our needs, but businesses are tending to focus on those anchor workers because of the adaptability that's required. And when it comes to being able to recover and rebound, they're relying very heavily on these kinds of new skills in order to do it. By the way, I only selected 8 of them. I had 12 of the tracking ones on my list, but I just thought these were interesting as a place to start. To this end, we've been doing some work on this already, and many of you would probably be well aware of it. One thing we're proud to talk about here is the revamp to a product we've had since, I think it's 2001 or 2, called Business Builders. And we've just done a sizable investment in the updating of the Business Builders program as an e-learning course. It's quite dynamic. It covers off some of the new topics we've talked about, informed by some of the new competency framework that we've been working on over the past 3 years, for which many of you have helped identify the new standards for practice. This interactive online program will be made available in April when we launch it. We are going to make it available for 6 months, right through until the end of September at no cost, which we hope will help businesses quickly engage in terms of some of those recovery skills that we're talking about. The value as well to doing this is the credit that is earned towards getting a form of recognition and certificate demonstrating that you have the knowledge required. This, by the way, builds on another product that many are also familiar with. We've launched this back in June. It's called tourismrecovery.ca. There were webinars added and a number of sources included. We encourage you to go there. The products are available at no cost and free and downloadable. This has been directly as a response to research in the market identifying the kinds of tools that businesses wanted to help with managing recovery. In fact, to help sort of sustain operations, manage recovery, and hopefully now to begin to build their businesses back. So those products are available to you, and we encourage you to go there, but more money and more effort is still required on the training front. But let's move on to the second strategy we think is very important to focus on, and we'll call it supply. On the supply front, it's very much a skills issue we're referring to here. There are some tools in place that are helping us hold on to workers. Most important, the wage subsidy that everyone would be familiar with, of course, is a very fortunate opportunity for us. It's been able to, I should reframe that. We know that the wage subsidy has contributed to how businesses have been not only been able to open, but been able to hold on to their staff. So this being able to sustain the wage subsidy program as long as we can would make a significant difference. And in fact, we would suggest that it probably should be increased somewhat given some of the scenarios over the next 8 to 12 months. But there is a new program that we're going to recommend, and we're calling it the Tourism Worker Recall Program. This idea is really about introducing a job recovery strategy that would help us bring back furloughed workers. It's envisioned that that very large pool, around more than 400,000 at this point, that we'll be able to hold on to them. Rather than have them on EI, we're proposing that they are brought back to work and help with business redevelopment and gain training and start to help with some of those community link initiatives, et cetera, so that they're ready to deploy and quickly help scale up businesses. You'll hear more from us in the coming weeks on that item. We are hoping to get a little more traction with that and a proposal, but it's a very tenuous and challenging one to anticipate. Still, it's all about trying to bring back furloughed workers. On the attraction side, we've been doing some serious work on proposals that are already in to extend work on attracting new Canadians to employment in tourism. Many of you would know our Destination Employment Program funded by Immigration IRCC. We've put a proposal in to extend that, and I mean not just in terms of time, but in terms of numbers and eligibility and so on. It is out there and pending approval. We're hopeful for it. And we are also working very closely with the federal government and the UNHRC, that's the High Commission on Refugees, to look at a possible program for tourism. So stay tuned. We'll keep you informed as we build those. So some of that is speculative for sure, but these are strategies we think are important to look at attracting new workers to our sector and holding on to the ones that we have invested in so heavily. The big gap, in fact, in policy right now, more than anything, is to do with the furloughed workers. So that becomes one of our priorities. Customer sentiment is the third category. Here too, there were two main ideas. The first one has to do with the idea of a standardized global health and safety issue. The protocols are being asked, and there are several groups already discussing and looking at trying to get universal standardized global health and safety protocols. And indeed, there are already some of these types of standards out there that emerged as a result of COVID. But still, there's not necessarily a level of coherence. And there are still a number of gaps, if you want, on where these protocols can apply and to whom. So there are various governments working on this, but we're thinking it's more than that. It's not just the universal component. It's also about the link of this to a Canadian quality standard so that we can create a competitive advantage in terms of getting back the trust of travelers, so that they recognize what Canada has done to invest in a system that's robust, that not only ensures people have the new skills and provides safety and health, but rather that it's really about the new Canadian brand of quality, and it helps support businesses with additional things, businesses and DMOs with the system around being more responsive with tools and information and supports as things continue to change over time. And we do see a need to revamp the employer campaign with Discover Tourism. Because of time, I won't go into that, but we will be submitting a proposal to update and revise some of our programming there with the intent of trying to attract new people to the sector. I might add that the idea of the seal of approval is something that's been talked about and bantered about for some time. Just one example would be a comment by Minister Joly, who of course acknowledges and recognizes the need for competitive advantage, but it's linked to the idea of safe tourism. We need a way to demonstrate that. Finally, there is the area of strategy. Here we are talking about strengthening and continuing to do more of the kind of labor market research we've talked about. But the thing I want to highlight today, and will include in a follow-up note, is we are going to initiate a new national workforce recovery panel. We will be inviting any leaders who wish to participate in this towards helping shape the future of the tourism workforce. It'll be a panel that will help inform, hopefully, some of the direction on where this goes. Finally, I'm just going to end this by actually flipping it back to Callum for a moment. There are a few opportunities we have with consultation coming up on the shaping of the future of tourism. Callum, if you don't mind, I'd love you to speak briefly on, well, I can just hold on the slide. You'll need to pick up the deck, but I'll let you speak on the employer consultation sessions coming up.
Perfect. Thank you, Phil. So yes, as Phil's mentioning, we really need at this point to start kind of looking to the future. A lot of the data that I was showing you, we have made some projections. We made those back in the fall, but we need to get a better sense of, are those projections accurate? And of course, our LFS data can show us what has happened, but we need to start preparing for what is going to happen. And so we actually have quite a significant research effort underway right now that's attempting to pull together not only all of the research that Tourism HR Canada is doing, but that all of the other associations and researchers out there are doing, so that we can try and get as accurately as possible. And of course, it's tough to do that, but we're trying to kind of get a picture of what is the likely scenario that the tourism sector in Canada is going to be in once we get to the summer or beyond. Where are we going to be when we start to recover, and how is that going to go, and what challenges are we going to face? Are some of the challenges that we had prior to COVID-19 going to be even greater than they were before? Have some of them been mitigated? Will there be other new challenges that are here because of COVID-19 that are going to stay with us going into the future? So as part of that, we are doing a series of consultations. We're consulting with both employers and with employees, both current and former employees as well, although those are coming later. Right now, we're looking towards our employer consultation sessions. We've got one upcoming in Atlantic Canada on February 4th, British Columbia, and that should actually say British Columbia and Alberta on February 4th as well. And then one's in Ontario, Quebec, the Prairie Provinces, and a French Quebec session in French on February 17th. If you are interested in participating in these sessions, please watch our HR Insider and our other newsletters and emails from our other industry partners, because we will all be promoting these sessions. So please look for these, look for opportunities to sign up for these. If you want to know more, please, by all means, feel free to reach out and get in touch with me directly.
Thank you, Callum. And one final message for everyone: our annual labor market forum, usually an event we hold in person. Of course, this year will be virtual. Mark your calendars. It'll be March 15th to 18. We have 4 jam-packed days of sessions scheduled. We will be sending out information on this in the near future. Please watch for it. We hope that you'll be able to join us. It's an opportunity for hearing from you and to help shape where we go. And the data that Callum just referred to, or the information we gather from those consultations, will be featured at this event. On behalf of Tourism HR Canada's Board of Directors, we want to thank you again for attending today's webinar. We encourage you to go to our website for further information, and we are happy to follow up with any of you one-on-one if you like, to further explain any information or answer any questions. Thank you, everyone.